In the spring of 1945, when the last fires of the European War were guttering out across a broken continent, America's Sherman tanks stood at the summit of their brief, violent glory. They lined the roads of Germany in columns that stretched beyond the horizon, green iron monuments to the largest armored force a democracy had ever assembled. They had crossed the English Channel on a promise, burned through the hedgerows of Normandy, frozen in the Ardennes, bridged the Rhine. Their crews had died inside them and beside them, and still the factories had sent more, always more. 50,000 of them, or close to it, built in the industrial heartland of a nation that had learned to treat war as a manufacturing problem. The Sherman was not the best tank of the Second World War. It was not the fastest, not the most heavily armored, not the most feared by those who faced it across open ground. What it was present, everywhere, always in numbers that exhausted the imagination of the men who opposed it. Where one Sherman burned, two more appeared. Where two burned, four followed. The arithmetic of mass production was its truest weapon. By VE Day in May 1945 and VJ Day that August, the arithmetic stopped. The factories went quiet. The orders were canceled. The convoys ceased. And an army of steel that had taken 4 years and the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers to build found itself without a war to justify its existence. The men who had crewed these machines came home to parades, to families, to the resumption of ordinary life. The tanks themselves had no ordinary life to resume. They were hardware now, surplus. A logistical problem measured in tens of thousands of units, scattered across 3 continents, rusting in staging areas, parked in fields, anchored in harbors, waiting for a future no one had yet decided to give them. What happened next? Almost no one remembers. The scale of what remained after the surrender was staggering, even by the standards of the war itself. The United States Army found itself in possession of armored vehicles it could not crew, could not ship home in any economical quantity, and could not simply abandon without consequence. Europe was not a vacuum. It was a ruin, and ruins attract those who would fill them. The Soviet Union sat across the Elbe with its own armored masses, its own ambitions, its own calculations. The question of what to do with surplus American armor was therefore not merely logistical. It was political, strategic, and immediate. The first and most lasting answer was transfer. The Sherman would not die. It would be redistributed. The mechanism for this was already in motion before the shooting stopped. The Lend-Lease program had sent hundreds of Shermans to the British, the Canadians, the Free French, the Poles, the Soviets, and others while the war still raged. Now, in the peace, a broader and more deliberate system of military assistance would carry the tank into the hands of nations that had not built it and would not have built it and yet found themselves in urgent need of armor. France retained the Shermans that had fought under its flag and incorporated them into the new French army. Britain kept its Fireflies and its standard hulls and modified them further. The Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, the liberated nations of northwestern Europe, all received allocations of American tanks as their armies reconstituted themselves from the wreckage of occupation. But the most consequential transfers lay elsewhere. In the Middle East, in South Asia, in the emerging alignments of a world that was no longer at war with the Axis, but was rapidly finding new axes of conflict along which to organize its fears, the Sherman would become the instrument of wars that its builders had never imagined and its original crews would never recognize. The tank's second life was beginning. It would be longer, stranger, and in some ways more consequential than its first. Korea came first, and Korea came quickly. By June of 1950, less than 5 years after the last Sherman had rolled across a European battlefield, the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel with Soviet-supplied Tis-34s and drove the under-equipped defenders of the South into a shrinking perimeter around Busan. The United States, in the shock of that first violent summer, reached for what it had. What it had, among much else, was Shermans, older now, worn from years in storage or modified for other purposes, but mechanically sound, logistically familiar, ready to be shipped and crewed. The M4A3E8, the so-called Easy 8, with its horizontal volute spring suspension, proved capable enough against the T-34 in the right conditions and at the right range. It was not a comfortable match. The T-34 had a longer gun and better sloped armor, but the Americans had air superiority, better logistics, and, again, numbers. The Sherman's old equation reasserted itself on Korean hillsides and in Korean river crossings and in the vicious urban fighting around Seoul. It was not a new war. It was, in some ways, a haunting. The same machines, the same doctrines, the same arithmetic, on different terrain and under a different sky, against a different enemy who had nonetheless read the same manual. When the Korean armistice came in 1953, the Sherman did not retire. It had proven itself still viable against mid-century opposition, at least in the hands of a force with sufficient supporting arms. And the nations that had received Shermans in the post-war transfers took note. Here was a tank that could still fight. Here was a machine that the world's most powerful military had endorsed by using it in combat as recently as last year. The appetite for surplus Shermans, already considerable, intensified. The tank's second life was not winding down. It was accelerating. Israel received its first Shermans through channels that were, to put it precisely, improvised. In 1948, when the state declared its independence and its Arab neighbors immediately went to war to prevent its survival, the nascent Israeli military acquired armor through purchase, through gift, through seizure, through the creative interpretation of embargoes. Shermans came from France, from Italy, from wherever surplus American tanks had washed up in the post-war distribution. They came stripped of their original armament, fitted with whatever guns were available, repainted, renumbered, and handed to young men who had never trained as tankers and learned the trade under fire. The Israeli relationship with the Sherman became something else entirely over the decades that followed. The Israeli Defense Forces did not merely use the Sherman. They rebuilt it. They re-engined it, replacing the original power plants with French diesel engines that were more reliable, less flammable, and easier to maintain in the Negev heat. They fitted it with the French 75mm high-velocity gun, then with the French 105mm, creating variants so far removed from the American original that they deserved and received new names. The Israelis called their modified Shermans the M50 and the M51, Isherman, in the informal shorthand, and they fought these machines through the Sinai Campaign of 1956, through the Six-Day War of 1967, through the War of Attrition, and into the early stages of the Yom Kippur War of 1973. In 1967, Israeli M51 Shermans armed with 105mm guns engaged and destroyed Egyptian T-54s and T-55s, Soviet tanks that were supposed to represent the next generation of armor that had been designed specifically to overmatch the aging American design. They did not, in the Sinai, overmatch anything. The Sherman, 25 years old and rebuilt beyond recognition, was still killing tanks. The ghost of American mass production, transplanted and transformed, was still fighting the wars of a century that had moved on without it. India went to war with Pakistan in 1965 and again in 1971. And in both conflicts, the Sherman was present on both sides of the line. Pakistan had received M4 variants through the Military Assistance Program, the American system of transferring surplus Cold War hardware to allied and aligned nations. India had acquired Shermans through similar channels in the years after independence. The subcontinent's armored battles were therefore, in part, American tanks fighting American tanks, former allies turned adversaries on dusty plains that the men who built the Sherman on the assembly lines of Detroit and Lima and Grand Blanc would never visit and could barely have located on a map. The Sherman performed poorly at Asal Uttar in 1965, where Pakistani M4s encountered Indian Centurions, and the results were catastrophic for the Pakistanis. 60 Pakistani tanks were destroyed or captured in a single engagement. The Shermans burned in the Punjab flatlands, far from Normandy, far from the Ardennes, far from the Pacific atolls, where other Shermans had fought in the amphibious assaults that opened the road to Tokyo. They burned in a war that no one in Washington had planned for, in service of a military alignment that no one in Washington fully understood, as part of a conflict that the Cold War framing of American foreign policy made difficult to interpret clearly. This was the Sherman's fate in many of its Second Life theaters. It became a pawn in strategic games too large for it, too complex for it, operating in political environments that had nothing to do with the war for which it was built. It was hardware in a world that had moved on, distributed by a logic of alliance management and strategic positioning that treated tanks as tokens rather than weapons. The men who died in them were just as dead as the men who had died in them in Europe. The steel burned just as hot. Beyond the wars, there was the quiet attrition of surplus itself. Not every Sherman found a buyer, a transferee, an ally in need. Many thousands of them were simply too old, too worn, too cosmetically damaged, or too far from the ports and the logistics chains that might have connected them to a second life abroad. These machines entered a different kind of fate, less dramatic than the burning tanks of the Sinai, less storied than the rebuilt Shermans of the IDF, but in its own way, more complete. They were reduced, they were erased, they were returned, as the military logisticians phrased it with impeccable bureaucratic neutrality, to the industrial base. Scrap drives had been a feature of the war itself, the collection of civilian metal for the production of military hardware. Now the equation reversed. Military hardware became the raw material for civilian reconstruction. Steel was steel. A Sherman hull could be melted down and recast as structural members for a bridge, or as automobile frames, or as any of the 1,000 products of the post-war industrial expansion that was transforming American life. The precise accounting of how many Shermans ended this way has been lost in the indifferent arithmetic of scrapyards and smelters and intermediate dealers who did not trouble themselves to record the provenance of the metal they processed. Thousands, certainly, perhaps tens of thousands. The record does not say, because no one thought the record worth keeping. There was a particular cruelty in this end that the men who had served in these vehicles might have felt, had they known it was happening. The tank that had been a home, cramped, terrifying, malodorous, but a home nonetheless, the most intimate space a soldier could occupy in the middle of a mechanized war, became a commodity. The name stenciled on the hull, the lucky charm welded to the glacis plate, the patina of 1,000 miles of European mud, none of it survived the furnace. What went in was history. What came out was iron. Some Shermans did not even receive the dignity of the furnace. They were driven to firing ranges and left there as targets. The logic was efficient and unkind. A decommissioned tank makes an excellent target for the next generation of anti-tank weapons. Because it is large, it is metal, it absorbs punishment, and it does not need to be replaced when it is destroyed. This was what the Army called a range target, and what a less clinical vocabulary might call a sacrifice. The tank was used to teach the weapons of the future how to kill the weapons of the past. On ranges from Fort Knox to Fort Hood to the training grounds of the Pacific, Shermans absorbed the fire of rockets, recoilless rifles, early guided missiles, and shaped charges as the American military worked through the taxonomy of anti-armor weapons it would need in a world where the next war might be fought against Soviet armor in the plains of Central Europe. The Sherman, once the defender, became the stand-in for the adversary. It was hit again and again until the hulls were perforated past all usefulness, until the steel was so fatigued and so riddled that even scrap merchants would not have it. At that point, it was pushed aside, bulldozed into a berm, or simply left where it sat, sinking slowly into the soil of military reservations that have their own slow geology. Some of these hulls still exist, partially buried, partially reclaimed by vegetation, on abandoned or active firing ranges across the American interior. They are not monuments. They are not memorials. They are artifacts of a process so mundane that no one thought to document it. They are what becomes of a weapon when the institution that built it finds a newer weapon and needs the older one to disappear. The sea received them too. In the years after the war, as the Army and Navy and various civilian agencies grappled with the problem of surplus military equipment, some Shermans and hulks of other armored vehicles and ships and aircraft were sunk deliberately. Some were used as breakwater material, their heavy hulls deployed as artificial barriers against coastal erosion where their mass was useful and their history was irrelevant. Others were sunk as artificial reefs, a practice that sounds almost romantic in retrospect. The tank descending through green water to become a habitat for fish and coral, a structure in the marine landscape, a monument to nothing but the utility of hard surfaces. Off the coasts of various islands in the Pacific, Shermans rest on the bottom today, corroding slowly in salt water, encrusted with marine life, visited occasionally by divers who photograph them and upload the images to platforms that did not exist when the tanks were built. There is something in this end that the imagination insists on treating as significant, as if the ocean floor were a more dignified resting place than a scrapyard. It may not be. The tank is equally gone, equally removed from human memory and institutional record, equally irretrievable. The water is simply a more beautiful archive than the furnace. Others went to the bottom less intentionally. Landing craft that capsized in post-war training exercises, ships that foundered in transit with armor aboard, incidents of carelessness or bad weather, or the ordinary entropy of large-scale military logistics. These too contributed to the subsurface inventory of lost Shermans that no official record accounts for and no survey has comprehensively cataloged. They are there, in the dark, in the cold, in the pressure, outlasting by decades the institutions and the men and the causes that brought them into being. What survived, survived by accident and by sentiment. A tank becomes a memorial when someone decides that it should, and that decision is almost never made by the institution that built the tank. It is made by veterans who do not want to forget, by communities that want to honor a loss, by museums that understand that an object can carry history in its steel in ways that documents and photographs cannot. The Sherman that sits on a stone plinth in a small town square in rural France, or in a park in a Polish city, or on the grounds of an American VFW post, is there because someone fought for it, fought to prevent it from being scrapped, from being transferred, from being melted down or drowned or forgotten in a field. The Bovington Tank Museum in England holds examples. The National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Benning holds examples. The Patton Museum, the museums of Normandy, the collections of Israel, France, Poland, the United States. These institutions have preserved what the normal processes of history would have destroyed. They have made archives of steel. They have argued against the logic of accounting that these objects matter, that you cannot understand what happened in 1944 or 1950 or 1967 without standing beside one of these machines and feeling the weight of its silence. The problem is that the survivors are not representative. The tanks that were preserved were, almost without exception, the tanks that were in relatively good condition, that were located near institutions with the resources to maintain them, that were associated with famous units or famous battles or famous men. The Shermans that burned in the Sinai and were left in the desert. The Shermans that sank in training accidents and were never raised. The Shermans that were melted down without ceremony in the scrap yards of 1946 and 1947. These are not in any museum. They are not on any plinth. They are nowhere, which is to say, they are everywhere, dissolved back into the material world from which they came, indistinguishable from the steel of 1,000 other things that were made from the same furnace. There is a question that hangs over all of this, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What does it mean to build something at such scale, and then to lose it so completely? 50,000 tanks, the labor of a nation at war, the deaths of thousands of men inside hulls whose serial numbers are recorded in documents that no one reads, the transformations of a machine that outlasted its original context and fought its way through 5 decades of wars its makers never imagined, in the hands of peoples who had nothing to do with the factories of Detroit and Lima and the ordnance depots of New Jersey. And then the long diminishment, the scrap drives, the ranges, the sea, the slow rusting in fields, and in the memories of fewer and fewer men who were there. The Sherman is not gone, not entirely. The survivors in the museums are real. The wrecks in the desert and the ocean floor are real. The institutional records, incomplete as they are, preserve something of what happened. But the living weight of what these machines meant, the fear and the noise and the smell and the particular quality of dying in them, the particular quality of surviving in them, the way they moved across a landscape and changed it, that is gone. It goes with the men who knew it. It goes with the generation that built them and crewed them and lost their friends inside them and came home and went to work in the same factories that had built the tanks and now built refrigerators and automobiles. The Sherman was a product of a specific moment in American history, the moment when the nation's industrial capacity was its decisive military advantage, and when that capacity was directed with something close to complete commitment toward the single purpose of winning a war. That moment is over. The tanks that embodied it are almost all gone. What remains is what always remains when a civilization passes through catastrophe and reconstruction: the archive, partial and imperfect, the handful of objects that survived by accident or devotion, and the question of whether the memory they carry is sufficient to the weight of what they represent. It is not sufficient. It never is. But it is what we have. If what happened to America's Shermans left something unresolved in you, that particular feeling when a weapon outlasts its purpose and its makers cannot decide what it was worth, then you will want to know what became of another American war machine that helped win the same war, served in the same post-war world, and vanished through a different kind of erasure. That story is waiting for you on this channel.